Jesse Thornfield thought he'd bought a piece of the American dream. 160 acres, a stone house, a working well, all for the cost of a few years of back taxes. He'd won it at a government auction, and when the hammer fell, a strange quiet settled over the room. The local folks, the ones who should have been bidding against him, they just stared. Not with anger, not with envy. It was pity. Jesse didn't understand it then. He just saw the deal of a lifetime. His wife, Sarah, sat beside him, her hand squeezing his. Their future was finally in their hands. A fresh start, far away from the railroad accident that had shattered Jesse's leg and ended his career. The settlement money wasn't much, but it was enough for this. It was enough for the ranch. Now, as their wagon crested the last hill, they saw it. The house stood against the sky, built of heavy gray stone. It looked less like a home and more like a fortress. Strong, permanent. But as they drew closer, Jesse felt a knot tighten in his gut. The same feeling he'd gotten from the looks on those faces at the auction. Something was wrong with this place. He helped Sarah down from the wagon, their entire life packed in the crates behind them. She walked toward the house, her steps hesitant. The afternoon sun was warm, but a chill seemed to radiate from the stone walls. She ran a hand over the rough-hewn rock, then stopped. She noticed the windows. They were small, almost like slits in a castle wall. And none of them, not a single one, faced the rolling hills to the north. It was as if the person who built this house was terrified of what was out there. As if they were deliberately refusing to look in that direction. Inside, the air was stale and cold. The kitchen was huge, with a fireplace big enough to roast a whole hog, but it felt dead. Unused. Sarah walked through the empty rooms, the sound of her own footsteps echoing back at her. The feeling of unease grew, a creeping dread she couldn't name. It felt like they weren't alone. It felt like the house was watching them. Jesse was outside, checking the well. The water was clear and deep, a good sign. He was starting to think the locals were just superstitious fools when he saw the dust cloud on the horizon. A single rider, coming their way. Not fast. Slow. Deliberate. Like he was in no hurry at all. The rider was an old man, his face a roadmap of wrinkles carved by sun and wind. He introduced himself as Boone Mackage. Said his place was about 5 miles east. He'd seen the smoke from their cook fire and came to say hello. But his eyes, sharp and intelligent, said something else entirely. This was not a social call. Boone got right to it. "Folks around here have feelings about this ranch," he said, his voice low. He told them the stories. Not ghost stories. Something worse. Stories of people just disappearing. Families who vanished overnight, leaving their supper on the table and their livestock in the fields. Travelers who stopped for a drink from the well and were never seen again. The family before them? They hadn't died. They'd just fled. Packed up in the middle of the night and left everything behind, telling folks they couldn't stand to be in that house one more second. "They say there are rooms in that house that should never be opened," Boone warned, his eyes flicking toward the stone structure. "Spaces that hold secrets best left buried." That was why no one from the county had bid. They knew the history. They knew the land was stained. Jesse listened politely, told Boone they weren't the types to be scared off by old tales. Boone just nodded slowly, his expression unchanging. As he turned his horse to leave, he offered one last piece of advice. "Trust your gut," he said. "If something feels wrong, it is." After he was gone, Sarah asked Jesse what he made of it. Jesse laughed it off, but he didn't feel like laughing. And he saw the way Sarah kept glancing up at the northern hills, the same hills the house refused to look at. As evening fell, Jesse was securing their horses in the corral. The work felt good, honest. For a moment, he let himself believe everything was fine. This was their home. Their future. Then Sarah called his name. Her voice was tight with fear. He ran to the kitchen window where she stood, pointing. Up on the ridgeline to the north, silhouetted against the dying sun, was a figure, a man on a horse. He wasn't moving. He was just sitting there, watching them. He stayed there for an hour, a black statue against a blood-red sky. Jesse felt a cold fury rise in him. He grabbed his rifle, but by the time he got back to the window, the ridge was empty. The rider was gone. But he wasn't gone. Not really. As Jesse and Sarah prepared for their first night in their new home, they had no idea that their observer was still out there, hidden in the dark. And after 22 years of waiting, his patience had finally run out. 3 days. For 3 days, David Whitlock had been crouched behind that boulder, watching. His hands, usually steady as a rock, trembled now. Not with fear, with rage. He watched the man and woman below, moving about the ranch house as if they owned the place, as if they had any right to be there. They didn't. This land wasn't theirs. This land was soaked in the blood of his family. He was 8 years old when it happened. The memory was burned into his mind, clearer than the landscape below. His mother's screams, his father's pleas for mercy, the glint of firelight on a knife, and his little sister. He could still see her terrified eyes, her small hand reaching for him just before he'd been found 3 days later half dead by a traveling merchant. He told his story. He told it to the merchant, to the sheriff, to anyone who would listen. He described the men, their faces, what they did, but no one believed him. They called it the ravings of a traumatized child. The sheriff rode out to the ranch, found it empty. No bodies, no blood, no sign of a crime. So they sent him away. An orphan, shipped off to a distant town to forget. But David never forgot. He didn't forget the faces of the men who butchered his family, and he sure as hell never forgot where they did it. For 22 years, that memory had been his fuel. He'd spent his life preparing for this moment. He learned to shoot, to track, to live off the land. He worked the most dangerous jobs he could find: mines, railroads, oil fields, saving every penny. Not for a home, not for a family, for weapons, for supplies, for revenge. When he returned 6 months ago, he found the ranch abandoned. Locals told him the same stories Boone had told the newcomers. Bad luck, disappearances, a cursed place. But no one remembered the Whitlocks. It was as if his family had been erased from history. David figured the killers had gotten spooked and fled years ago. He was prepared to wait the rest of his life for them to come back. Then, 3 days ago, the wagon had appeared. These new people, they had to be connected. Why else would anyone come here? To this specific place, with its poisoned reputation. They had to be kin to the murderers, or partners, come back to claim the land their family had stolen with blood. He watched them. The man, Jesse, fixing a fence. The woman, Sarah, planting a small garden. They moved with an easy confidence, completely unaware that a ghost from the past was watching their every move. A ghost who was about to become their judge, jury, and executioner. Evil, David knew, often wore a friendly face. The men who killed his family had seemed kind at first. They'd shared his father's fire, eaten his mother's food. Then, when everyone was asleep, they had revealed their true selves. As the sun bled out behind the hills, David made his final preparations. He laid out the cans of kerosene. Fire. It had to be fire. The house itself was the weapon that had hidden their crime. It was only right that it should be their tomb. The stone walls would act like an oven, trapping them inside while the wooden floors and roof burned around them. He would give them a few moments. A few moments to feel the heat, to smell the smoke, to understand that their family's sins had finally come home to roost. He checked his rifle, loaded a round into the chamber. If, by some miracle, one of them made it out of the fire, he would be waiting. Nothing would stop him. Not this time. Darkness fell. Absolute and silent. David began his slow, careful approach to the house. Inside, Jesse and Sarah Thornfield slept, dreaming of their new life. They had no idea their past had finally caught up with them. A past they didn't even know they had. The first thing that hit Jesse was the smell. Acrid smoke, so thick it felt like he was breathing in hot tar. He snapped awake, his lungs on fire. The bedroom was a swirling chaos of gray and black. He couldn't see, couldn't breathe. He grabbed Sarah, shaking her awake. "Fire!" She woke up coughing, her eyes wide with terror. Jesse dragged her toward the window, but a wall of orange flame was already climbing the outside of the house, devouring the wooden frame. The fire was everywhere, moving with an unnatural speed, as if the house itself was desperate to burn. They stumbled toward the front door, choking on the toxic fumes. It was blocked. A massive burning beam had crashed down, sealing their exit. The back door was worse, a roaring inferno. They were trapped. And then Jesse heard it. Over the crackle and roar of the flames, he heard a sound that turned his blood to ice. Laughter. A man's laughter, high and wild with triumph. It wasn't the sound of joy. It was the sound of pure, unadulterated madness. Someone was out there. Someone had done this. And they were enjoying it. "Jesse!" Sarah screamed, pointing toward the kitchen. The ceiling there was groaning, ready to give way, but it was their only chance. They dropped to the floor, crawling beneath the thickest smoke. Burning embers rained down around them, singeing their clothes and hair. The heat was immense, blistering their skin. They reached the kitchen just as a huge section of the roof collapsed. A massive support beam, burning like a giant torch, slammed into the stone floor right in front of them. The impact was deafening. The entire house shook. And then something impossible happened. Where the beam hit, the floorboards shattered. But underneath, there wasn't dirt. There was a black, gaping hole, a set of stone steps leading down into the darkness, a hidden cellar. There was no time to think. Jesse shoved Sarah toward the opening. "Go!" They tumbled down the narrow steps, the fire roaring above them. They were in a small, stone-walled chamber. It felt like a tomb. Sarah, with a final surge of strength, managed to grab a heavy wooden door and pull it shut just as the rest of the kitchen ceiling came crashing down. The sound was like the end of the world. The door was thick, reinforced with iron straps. It held. They were in total darkness. The air was cooler, but smoke was still seeping in through the cracks around the door. Jesse fumbled for his matches, his hands shaking. He struck one. The tiny flame flickered to life, revealing a small, windowless room carved from solid rock. And that's when he saw what was on the far wall. They weren't alone. Lying in a heap against the stone were two skeletons. They were sprawled in unnatural positions, as if they had died in the middle of a violent struggle. One of them had a rusty knife still clutched in its bony fingers. The other's skull was caved in, a spiderweb of cracks from a massive blow. They had killed each other. Down here, in the dark. Jesse and Sarah stared, frozen in horror. This wasn't a root cellar. This was a grave. And as the smoke continued to pour in, they realized it was about to become their grave too. Jesse felt his head spin, his lungs burning. The last thing he heard before the blackness took him was Sarah whispering his name. Outside, David Whitlock watched the flames reach for the sky. His work was done. Justice, after 22 long years, had been served. The laughter died in his throat, replaced by a grim, quiet satisfaction. He mounted his horse and turned toward the county seat. He was going to turn himself in. He was going to confess. It was a fair price to pay. He had no idea that deep beneath the inferno, his intended victims were still alive. And they had just stumbled into a secret far more terrible than the fire he had set. They were trapped in a stone box with the dead, and the truth about this cursed land was about to be revealed. Jesse's eyes fluttered open. Complete darkness. His head felt like it had been split open with an axe, and his throat was raw. He could taste ash. Beside him, Sarah coughed, a weak, ragged sound. They were alive, but they were buried. He remembered the skeletons. His hand fumbled in his pocket for the matches. The first one scraped and died, the second one caught. In the brief flickering light, he saw them again. The two skeletons, locked in their silent, violent embrace. He found an old lantern on a dusty shelf and, after a few tries, its wick caught, casting a steady, golden glow around their prison. Now they could see everything. This wasn't just a cellar, it was a vault, a hiding place. Wooden crates were stacked against the walls, covered in decades of dust and cobwebs. Tools, supplies, things someone had wanted to keep hidden. Very hidden. Jesse moved the lantern closer to the skeletons. Between them, scratched into the stone of the wall, was a crude drawing. It looked like a map. It showed the ranch house, the well, and a strange cluster of 3 large rocks about 200 yards to the north. An X was carved next to the rocks. Treasure. These two men had killed each other over a hidden treasure. Sarah, still weak, pushed herself up. Jesse, look. She was pointing at the crates. Jesse pried one open with a rusted shovel he found in the corner. It wasn't filled with tools or supplies. It was filled with personal belongings. A woman's silver locket, a child's worn leather doll, a man's pocket watch, its chain tangled around a pair of spectacles. They were stolen goods. He opened another crate. More of the same. Jewelry, clothes, a Bible with a family name written inside. Miller. None of it belonged to the skeletons. These were trophies. Mementos taken from dozens of different people. This chamber wasn't just a grave. It was a lair, the home of predators. And as Jesse examined the heavy door that had saved them, he noticed something chilling. There was no handle on the inside, only a large iron bolt. It was designed to be locked from the outside. Whoever built this room never intended for anyone they put in here to get out. They hadn't been saved by the door. They had been lucky the collapsed ceiling hadn't jammed it shut permanently. They were in a death chamber. After what felt like an eternity, they felt strong enough to try the door. Pushing together, they managed to move it just enough to squeeze through the debris. They climbed out of the darkness and into a nightmare. Their home was gone. The stone wall still stood, blackened and scarred. But the roof, the floors, everything they owned, was a mountain of smoldering ash. In the distance, they saw riders, 3 of them, moving fast. Jesse recognized the glint of a badge. The law. Relief washed over him. They were safe. They could tell the marshal what happened. About the fire, the laughter, the hidden tomb beneath their feet. They had no idea their nightmare was just beginning. Marshal Ty Morrison was a hard man in a hard country. He surveyed the ruins of the Thornfield Ranch with a grim expression. Jesse, his voice hoarse, quickly told him about the fire, the maniacal laughter. But before he could mention the cellar, Morrison held up a hand, stopping him. "We know," the marshal said, his voice flat. "He's already in my jail." Jesse and Sarah stared at him, stunned. "A young man. Walked into my office just before dawn, reeking of kerosene," Morrison continued, his eyes narrowed, studying Jesse. "Confessed to the whole thing. Said he burned the place down with 2 people inside. Name's David Whitlock." Morrison explained that Whitlock was clearly insane, ranting about justice for his family, murdered 30 years ago. A crime no one had any record of. A story the marshal had dismissed as the delusions of a madman. Until now. Now he had 2 people who were supposed to be dead, standing right in front of him. And their house was most certainly a pile of ash. Jesse finally told him. He told him about the floor, the hidden steps, the chamber carved from solid rock. Morrison's expression shifted from suspicion to disbelief. But when Jesse led him to the hole in the kitchen floor, the marshal had no choice but to see for himself. He descended into the darkness, his deputy following with a lantern. The silence stretched. When Morrison emerged a few minutes later, his face was pale. He had seen the skeletons. He had seen the crates of stolen belongings. The madman's story suddenly didn't seem so mad anymore. Morrison realized he was standing on the edge of something vast and terrible. This wasn't a simple arson case. This was a mystery 30 years in the making. And the key to it all was the young man sitting in his jail cell, the man who had tried to murder these two innocent people. The man who had, completely by accident, just blown a secret criminal empire wide open. Dr. Benjamin Hayes, the county physician and part-time coroner, knelt beside the skeletons. Marshall Morrison held the lantern steady, watching the doctor's face. Hayes was meticulous, pointing out the cause of death for each: a crushed skull on one, multiple stab wounds on the other. "They've been down here a long time," Hayes murmured, examining a shred of rotted clothing. 30 years, give or take. 30 years. The exact time frame from David Whitlock's delusional story. The doctor moved on to the crates, cataloging the grim collection of personal effects. Watches, rings, lockets, enough to prove that dozens of people had met their end on this ranch. Then, from the bottom of a crate, he pulled out a small tarnished silver object. A pocket watch. He wiped the grime from its cover. Engraved on the front were a set of initials: W. William Whitlock. Morrison sent his deputy back to town with a new set of orders. "Bring David Whitlock here. Now." David arrived in shackles, his face a mask of confusion. He had been so sure his quest was over, but the couple he intended to kill were alive, and now he was being dragged back to the source of all his pain. Morrison didn't say a word. He just held up the pocket watch. The effect was instantaneous. David's composure shattered. "My father's," he choked out, tears streaming down his face. The grief he had suppressed for 22 years came pouring out in a flood of ragged sobs. And for the first time, he told the full story. Not as a ranting madman, but as a traumatized child finally being heard. He described the night in perfect, chilling detail. The two men who welcomed his family. The sound of angry voices that woke him. Peeking through the wagon boards, he watched them attack his parents and sister with a savage fury. He described how they dragged the bodies into the house. He had hidden under the wagon until dawn, then ran for his life. His story had never changed. It was the world that had refused to listen. While David spoke, Dr. Hayes was examining a stack of damp, moldy documents they'd found in another crate. Property deeds, bills of sale, and all of them were clumsy forgeries. It was a clear pattern, a systematic operation to murder travelers, steal their possessions, and forge documents to claim their land and assets. This ranch was their headquarters, the hidden chamber, their abattoir. But then, Dr. Hayes found the most damning piece of evidence of all. Among the forgeries was a stack of correspondence. Letters between the two killers, planning their crimes. And on several of the forged deeds, there was a signature. A signature that made Marshall Morrison's blood run cold. It was the signature of William Crane, the man who had been the sheriff of this county 30 years ago. Crane and his brother had vanished around the same time the Whitlock family was murdered. Everyone assumed they'd just moved on. But Morrison knew, with a certainty that chilled him to the bone, that he was looking at their final resting place. The two skeletons in the cellar were the Crane brothers. The sheriff, the man sworn to uphold the law in this territory, was one of the monsters. He and his brother had used his badge as a shield, luring unsuspecting travelers to their doom. And when greed finally got the better of them, they had turned on each other, dying in the very tomb they had built for their victims. Morrison looked at the crude map scratched on the wall. The treasure map. The final piece of the puzzle. David Whitlock, in a misguided act of fiery revenge against two innocent people, hadn't just found justice for his own family. He had accidentally uncovered the truth about the two most prolific serial killers in the territory's history. he had exposed a conspiracy that reached into the heart of the law itself. And the search for the Crane brothers' buried treasure was about to reveal the true horrifying scale of their crimes. The dig began at dawn. Marshal Morrison deputized Jesse and a few other men from town. Sarah insisted on helping, her face set with grim determination. This was their land, and they would see this through to the end. David Whitlock, his shackles removed, worked alongside them. The rage that had driven him for 2 decades was gone, replaced by a focused, somber energy. He wasn't a killer. He was a witness. The last witness. The map on the cellar wall led them to a small clearing, marked by 3 large triangular stones. The ground was hard, and the work was slow. For hours, the only sound was the scrape of shovels against rock and dirt. Then, about 4 feet down, a shovel struck something solid with a dull thud. Wood. They dug carefully now, clearing the dirt away to reveal the lid of a large wooden chest, bound with rusted iron straps. It took 4 men to haul it out of the ground. It was heavy, impossibly heavy. Morrison pried the lid open with a crowbar. A collective gasp went through the small crowd. Gold. The chest was filled nearly to the brim with gold coins, stacks of paper money, and a glittering heap of silver jewelry. It was a fortune, enough to make a man king of the county. This was what the Crane brothers had killed for. This was the blood money that had cost David his family and dozens of others their lives. But beneath the top layer of gold and jewels, there was something else. Morrison reached in and pulled out a thick, leather-bound book. A ledger. He opened it. The pages were filled with names, dozens of them. Beside each name was a date and a list of items. Miller family, June 1883. 1 wagon, 2 horses, silver locket, $200 cash. John P. Anderson, August 1883. Gold pocket watch, $50 cash. Whitlock family, May 1885. 1 wagon, 4 horses, silver pocket watch, wedding rings, $450 cash. It was a meticulous record of their slaughter, a complete list of their victims. The ledger went on for pages and pages. Families, lone travelers, prospectors, anyone who had been unlucky enough to cross the Crane brothers' path. Marshal Morrison realized this wasn't just a local problem. He sent telegrams to every lawman in the territory, listing the names from the ledger. The replies started trickling in within hours. Every name matched a missing persons report from the last 30 years. The Crane brothers hadn't just been preying on people passing through their county. They had been a plague on the entire frontier. Jesse and Sarah watched as the chest was loaded onto a wagon to be taken back to town as evidence. Under the law, as the current owners of the property, they had a legal claim to the treasure. It was enough money to solve all their problems forever. But they both knew they couldn't touch it. It was cursed. Every coin was stained with blood. That night, they told Morrison they wanted no part of it. The money had to go back to the families of the victims, if any could be found. For David, seeing that ledger was a profound release. The hatred that had been his only companion for 22 years finally began to dissolve. His quest for revenge had been blind and misguided. He had almost killed the 2 people who would, in the end, help him find the real truth. He went to Jesse and Sarah, and with tears in his eyes, he apologized. He had been so wrong, but the investigation was far from over. The ledger contained more than just the names of victims. In the back, there was another list, a shorter one, under the heading Partners. It listed several other prominent names from the county, men who had helped the Crane brothers falsify deeds and cover their tracks. Some of them were still alive, still living in the area. The conspiracy was bigger than anyone could have imagined. David Whitlock's fire had not just uncovered a 30-year-old crime. It had ignited a firestorm that was about to burn through the entire county, exposing a rot that went all the way to the core. Justice for the dead was only the beginning. Now, it was time to hunt the living. The news spread like a prairie fire. The story of the Butcher brothers and their hidden chamber of horrors was on the front page of every newspaper in the territory. As the names from the ledger were published, a slow, heartbreaking pilgrimage began. Families started arriving at the ranch. Elderly men and women, middle-aged children who'd grown up without parents, all coming to the place where their loved ones had drawn their final breath. They brought faded photographs and yellowed letters, helping Dr. Hayes match the personal items from the treasure chest to the victims. An old woman wept as Morrison handed her a simple gold ring. It had been her brother's. He'd vanished 28 years ago on his way to California. She had never known what happened. Until now. Jesse and Sarah, instead of abandoning the cursed land, chose to stay. They became the unofficial caretakers of a tragedy. They offered coffee and comfort to the grieving families, listening to their stories. The ranch was no longer just their property. It was a sacred ground, a place of memory. David Whitlock found a new purpose. The fire for revenge had been replaced by a quiet, fierce dedication to justice. He worked tirelessly with Marshall Morrison, his sharp memory of the past proving invaluable. He could describe other families he had seen at the ranch as a boy, helping to identify more victims and piece together the timeline of the Crane brothers' reign of terror. He led search parties into the hills around the property. They found more graves. Scattered in shallow, unmarked pits, they unearthed the remains of at least 12 more people. Each discovery was a fresh wave of grief, but also a moment of closure for a family that had spent decades in the dark. The list of partners from the ledger led to a series of stunning arrests: a local banker, a wealthy landowner. Men who were pillars of the community were exposed as accomplices to mass murder, their reputations and lives crumbling to dust. The whole county was forced to reckon with the evil it had harbored for a generation. Jesse and Sarah made a final decision. They formally relinquished their claim on the treasure, petitioning the territorial government to use the money to create a proper memorial. They would not raise cattle on this land. They would raise headstones. With funding from the government and donations that poured in from around the territory, the ranch began to transform. A simple stone monument was erected, engraved with the names of every known victim. Sarah planted a garden of wildflowers around the site where the treasure was found. The hidden chamber beneath the house was sealed, a permanent monument to the darkness that had once resided there. It would serve as a reminder. David, no longer haunted by the ghosts of his past, became the guardian of this new place. He dedicated his life to helping other families find answers, corresponding with lawmen across the West, turning his personal tragedy into a crusade for others. The ranch, once a place of death and terror, was slowly being reborn. It was becoming a symbol not of the evil that had happened there, but of the justice that had, against all odds, finally prevailed. The wounds were deep, and the healing would take years. But for the first time in a very long time, the sun that set over the northern hills didn't seem to be setting on a place of horror. It felt like it was setting on a place of peace. 2 years later, the ranch was unrecognizable. Jesse and Sarah had rebuilt their house, using the original stone, but the design was different. It was open and welcoming, with a large common room where visiting families could gather. It wasn't just a home anymore. It was a sanctuary. David Whitlock lived in a small, simple cabin he'd built himself near the entrance to the grounds. He was the official caretaker, the keeper of the stories. His transformation was complete. The boy who had survived a massacre to become a man bent on revenge was now a guardian of memory, his face calm, his eyes filled with a quiet purpose. The territorial government had declared the site a historical memorial. A proper cemetery now stood where Sarah's garden had first been planted. Neat rows of white headstones marked the final resting place for all the recovered remains. Each stone bore a name, a final testament that these people had lived and that they were not forgotten. Marshall Morrison, now the head territorial marshal for the entire region, had used the Crane brothers case to revolutionize law enforcement. His investigation ultimately solved 43 cold cases, bringing a final, painful peace to families across the country. The ranch became a model for how to investigate the dark patterns of violence that so often went unnoticed on the frontier. The treasure, after a long legal process, was distributed to the surviving families. It couldn't replace what they had lost, but for many, it provided the means to live without the financial struggle that had been added to their grief. Jesse and Sarah even used the reward money they received from the government to start a fund to help families with travel expenses, ensuring that anyone who wanted to pay their respects could make the journey. On the second anniversary of the fire, a large ceremony was held at the memorial. Hundreds of people came: family members, lawmen, politicians. David Whitlock stood before them and spoke. He didn't speak of hatred or revenge. He spoke of healing. He spoke of how a singular, terrible act had, through a strange and painful path, led to a collective good. As the sun began to set, casting long shadows across the rows of headstones, Jesse Thornfield addressed the crowd. He spoke of how their simple dream of starting a new life had led them down a path into one of the territory's darkest chapters. But he also spoke of the light that had come from it, the truth, the justice, the community of survivors that had been forged in shared loss. The memorial, he declared, would stand forever. A place to mourn, yes, but also a permanent reminder that the truth, no matter how deep it's buried, can always be brought into the light. Later that night, long after everyone else had gone, David walked through the quiet cemetery. The air was cool and still. He stopped at the marker that bore the names of his mother, his father, and his little sister. He touched the cool stone. He told them, in a quiet voice, that it was over. That they were not just a ghost story anymore. Their names were known. Their memory was honored. The rage that had been the engine of his life for 22 years was finally, truly gone. In its place was a profound and lasting peace. The evil of the Crane brothers had been great, but in the end, it had been defeated. Not by a bullet, not by a rope, but by memory. The ranch was no longer a place of death. It had become a testament to life. If you were moved by this story of justice and redemption, and want to hear more tales where the truth is stranger than fiction, don't forget to like this video and hit that subscribe button. It helps the channel more than you know.